My skull cracked against the Montgomery Estate's imported marble floor, the copper taste of my own blood flooding my mouth. The last sound I heard before the dark took me was my sister's delicate, breathless laughter. Then my eyes snapped open. I wasn't in a coffin. I was sitting on the scratchy tweed sofa of the state foster agency, inhaling the sharp, stinging scent of industrial bleach and cheap coffee. It was 10 years earlier, the adoption day, as Hannah dug her manicured nails into my wrist, desperate to steal the perfect family for herself. I went entirely still. Take them, sister. I thought, the ghost of a fractured skull still throbbing at my temple. I'll enjoy the show. Rebirth doesn't feel like waking up from a dream. It feels like being dragged backward through a freezing river. My lungs seized. I gasped a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the cramped office of Mrs. Gable, our social worker. The air in the room was suffocatingly hot, thick with the smell of dust motes baking in the afternoon sun, and the metallic tang of anxious sweat. My sweat. Charlie, are you paying attention? Mrs. Gable's voice was a nasal drone that scraped against my eardrums. I blinked the blurry shapes in front of me, sharpening into agonizing, hyper-realistic clarity. There she was, Hannah, sitting right beside me on the miserable, itchy tweed sofa. She smelled of the cheap vanilla body spray she used to steal from the older girls at the group home. Her blonde hair was perfectly brushed, her posture rigid, with practiced innocence. She looked 14 again, because she was 14 again, and I was 15. I looked down at my hands. They were unscarred. The crooked, poorly healed ring finger on my left hand, broken by Richard Montgomery when I was 19 for dropping a crystal wine glass, was perfectly straight. My skin was smooth, pale, and intact. I pressed my thumb hard into my palm until the nail dug in, testing the reality of the pain. It flared sharp and grounding. I was alive. I was back. Sitting across from us in the cramped office were two couples, the architects of our futures. On the left sat Richard and Beatrice Montgomery. They were a portrait of old money perfection draped in muted cashmeres and understated pearl jewelry. Beatrice sat with her ankles crossed, her spine so straight it looked painful, exuding a faint, powdery scent of crushed irises and cold superiority. Richard was beside her, his face a mask of polite, paternal interest. To anyone else, they looked like a dream, a golden ticket out of the system. I looked at Richard's hands, resting on his knees, large, impeccably manicured. I remembered the exact weight of those hands closing around my throat. I remembered the sound of his heavy leather brogues pacing the hardwood floors outside my locked bedroom door, the slow, rhythmic click-clack of a predator pacing a cage. A wave of nausea, thick and cold, rolled through my stomach. On the right sat Anthony and Maeve Powell, nouveau riche, chaotic, unpolished. Anthony was a massive man squeezing out of a custom suit that somehow still looked cheap because of the loud navy pinstripes. He was chewing a nicotine gum with aggressive speed, smelling strongly of peppermint and expensive leather. Maeve had too much volume in her hair diamonds that were slightly too large to be considered tasteful by the elite, and a warm, flushed face. In my first life, Hannah had leaned over to me right before this meeting and whispered, "The Powells look like fun. Let me have the Montgomerys, Charlie. I need the quiet, like an idiot, like the protective older sister I thought I was supposed to be." I had agreed. I took the loud, messy Powells, thinking I was giving Hannah the fairy tale. But the adoption agency had a sudden twist The Montgomerys had specifically requested the older sister, me, and the Powells were perfectly happy to take Hannah. We were separated. Hannah went to the Powells, where she thrived, in a loud, aggressively loving environment, inheriting a ruthless real estate empire. I went to the Montgomerys, where I was starved, gaslit, physically broken, and eventually murdered to secure a trust fund payout. And Hannah had found out. She had visited the Montgomery estate the day I died. She stood over my bleeding body, looked at Richard, and smiled. She always was too fragile for this world, she had purred. "Well, girls," Mrs. Gable said, clapping her hands together, breaking my reverie. "Both of these wonderful families are prepared to welcome one of you into their homes today. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery have expressed a strong interest in Charlie, given her maturity." Beside me, Hannah stiffened. I felt the heat of her resentment radiating through the thin fabric of my faded cotton dress. Her breathing turned shallow. The vanilla scent suddenly smelled sour. "Actually," Hannah spoke up, her voice trembling with just the right amount of practiced, pathetic vulnerability. She looked at Richard and Beatrice, her eyes wide and glassy. "I know I'm younger, but I've always dreamed of a quiet home, a place with discipline. I read about your philanthropic work, Mr. Montgomery. I want to be exactly like you." Beatrice's perfectly plucked eyebrows twitched upward. Richard leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto Hannah, a predator recognizing a willing, eager prey. "Is that so, Hannah?" Richard asked. His voice was smooth velvet over broken glass. I suppressed a full-body shudder. "Yes, sir," Hannah breathed. She reached out and suddenly, viciously pinched the back of my arm, a silent command for me to back down. I looked at my sister, the flush of ambition on her cheeks, the desperate, greedy light in her eyes. She wanted the money. She wanted the prestige. She looked at the Montgomerys and saw a crown. She didn't see the cage. I could have stopped it. I could have said, "No, I'm the older sister. I'm the one they want." I could have saved her from the daily weigh-ins, the psychological torture, the locked basement room. I could have saved her from Richard's heavy hands, but I tasted the ghost of copper blood in my mouth. I heard the echo of her laughter as I bled out on the marble. I relaxed my shoulders, feigning a defeated slump. I looked down at my scuffed sneakers. "Hannah is right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, perfectly playing the part of the intimidated orphan. "She's much better suited for your lifestyle, Mr. Montgomery. I think I'd be too much trouble. I'm too loud." Anthony Powell let out a booming laugh that made the windows rattle. "Loud is good, kid. We like loud in our house." Richard's eyes lingered on me for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance at losing his first choice, a victim, before his gaze slid back to Hannah, settling heavily on her delicate frame. "Well, we certainly wouldn't want to separate a girl from her dreams." Hannah beamed a radiant, triumphant smile. She shot me a sideways glance, a fleeting look of smug superiority, convinced she had just outsmarted me, convinced she had stolen my golden ticket. "You have no idea," I thought, keeping my eyes glued to the floor so no one could see the dark, ugly smile stretching across my soul. "Enjoy your crown, Hannah. It's going to crush your neck." The back seat of the Powell's customized Bentley smelled like sharp, aftershave peppermint and the faint, lingering odor of fast food French fries. It was a chaotic smell, a human smell. I sat, pressed against the leather door, my knees pulled tightly together, waiting for the trap to spring. For the first 3 weeks at the Powell estate, my nervous system was a live wire. The house itself was a sprawling, modern monstrosity of glass, steel, and loud art. There were no hushed tones here. Anthony yelled into his brick-sized cell phone at all hours of the night. Maeve played Italian opera at deafening volumes while cooking massive, messy meals in a kitchen that looked like a commercial bakery. It was terrifying. In my past life, noise in the Montgomery house meant danger. A raised voice meant a closed-door lesson. A dropped plate meant a week without dinner. Here, noise was just noise. I remember the first time I shattered a glass. It was a Tuesday evening. I was reaching for a pitcher of iced water on the marble island, but my hands were slick with cold sweat. The pitcher slipped. It hit the floor with a catastrophic crash, sending ice and jagged shards of heavy crystal exploding across the terracotta tiles. The sound was a gunshot in my head. Before I even registered what I was doing, I had dropped to my knees, curling into a tight, protective ball, my hands shielding the back of my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable strike. The kick to the ribs, the cold, hissing voice in my ear telling me how worthless I was. The kitchen went dead silent. The opera music was suddenly cut off. I heard heavy footsteps approaching. I squeezed my eyes tighter, my breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. Please, I prayed to a God I didn't believe in. Not the face. Just let him avoid the face. Jesus, kid, don't move. You're gonna cut your knees up. The voice wasn't a hiss. It was Anthony's rough, gravelly baritone. It wasn't angry. It was panicked. Large, warm hands gripped my shoulders. I flinched violently, a choked sob tearing from my throat. Hey, whoa, easy. I gotcha. Anthony didn't drag me up by my hair. He scooped me up, awkward and gentle, lifting me clear of the broken glass. He set me down on a bar stool, out of the danger zone. I cracked my eyes open, trembling violently. Maeve was already on the floor, with a broom sweeping up the mess with frantic energy. I'm sorry. I gasped out the words, tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. I'm so sorry, I'll pay for it. I'll clean it. I didn't mean to, please, don't. Charlie, stop, Anthony said, kneeling down, so his massive, craggy face was level with mine. He smelled like cigar smoke and spearmint. He wasn't looking at me with disgust. He looked heartbroken. It's just a damn cup. Cost me $50. I wiped my ass with $50. Are you hurt? I stared at him, my brain short-circuiting. I'm not hurt. Good. He reached out and awkwardly patted my head, a heavy, clumsy gesture. Don't ever get on your knees for broken glass in this house, you hear me? We pay people to clean, and if we didn't, I'd clean it. You're a Powell now. Act like it. I sat on that bar stool for an hour after they left the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. The contradiction tore at my chest. I was safe. I was actually physically safe. And because I was safe, the reality of where Hannah was became a suffocating weight. I started tracking her. I couldn't help it. It wasn't out of love. It was a morbid, twisted compulsion. I became a ghost in the Powell mansion, sitting in the dark corners of the library, with my laptop scouring the high society blogs and local society pages. The first photo of Hannah surfaced 2 months after the adoption. It was from the Montgomery's annual summer solstice garden party. The picture showed Hannah standing between Richard and Beatrice. She was wearing a pale yellow tea dress that went past her knees. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, tight chignon. She looked beautiful, elegant, refined, but I knew what to look for. I zoomed in on the high-resolution image, my heart pounding a slow, dark rhythm. There it was, the posture. Her shoulders were pulled back just a fraction, too far straining the fabric of her dress. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but her knuckles were slightly white, and Richard's hand was resting gently, casually, on the back of her neck. To the world, it looked like a father's protective touch. To me, it was a brand. I knew the exact pressure of his thumb against the C7 vertebra, the silent threat, smile, or you don't eat tomorrow. I touched the screen, trailing my finger over Hannah's frozen, perfectly painted smile. A cold, heavy lump formed in my throat, a mixture of profound pity and a deeply vicious, acidic satisfaction. You wanted the crown, Hannah. I whispered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the vastness of my safe, gilded cage. Now you have to wear it. The Autumn Equinox Charity Gala was the first time our worlds officially collided. 6 months had passed. In that time, I had grown into the Powell name. I stopped hoarding bread in my nightstand. I stopped flinching when doors slammed. Maeve had taken me to every high-end boutique in the city, dressing me not as a delicate doll, but as a young woman with teeth. For the gala, I wore a dress of heavy midnight blue silk. It had a plunging neckline that Beatrice Montgomery would have called vulgar, and a slit up the thigh that allowed me to walk with long, powerful strides. My dark hair was left loose, falling in messy, intentional waves over my shoulders. I felt like armor wrapped in liquid night. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel smelled overwhelmingly of roasted duck-heavy perfume and the desperate sweat of people trying to network their way into a higher tax bracket. The clinking of champagne flutes and the dull roar of 100 simultaneous conversations washed over me. Anthony was immediately swarmed by business rivals, barking laughter and clapping backs. Maeve was instantly distracted by a woman wearing what looked like a dead bird on her head. I was left alone by the ice sculpture, sipping sparkling water, feeling the cold condensation against my palm. Then the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The Montgomerys had arrived. They moved through the crowd like royalty, cutting through peasants. Richard in a pristine tuxedo, Beatrice in a structured emerald gown, and trailing half a step behind them, as protocol dictated, was Hannah. My breath caught. She was wearing a pale pink chiffon dress that made her look 12 years old, despite being almost 15 now. It was modest, high-necked, and entirely devoid of personality. Her blonde hair was curled into perfect, lifeless ringlets. But it was her face that made the bile rise in my throat. Her skin was translucent pale in a way that wasn't natural. The baby fat in her cheeks had completely vanished, leaving her cheekbones sharp and hollow. The heavy, expertly applied foundation couldn't hide the dark exhaustion, bruised shadows beneath her eyes. She caught my eye from across the room. For a split second, the polished mask slipped. A raw, naked panic flared in her gaze. It was the look of an animal that realizes the trap has already snapped shut. Then, Richard turned his head slightly. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Hannah immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, her spine snapping perfectly straight. The obedient daughter. I took a slow sip of my water, the ice clinking against my teeth. I felt a surge of adrenaline, dark and potent. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray and began to navigate the crowd, moving with the lazy, unbothered grace that drove old money purists insane. I timed it perfectly. As Beatrice engaged a local senator in conversation, Hannah slipped away toward the powder rooms. I followed the scent of her vanilla perfume, now masked by a heavy, expensive rosewater scent that smelled distinctly like Beatrice. The women's lounge was empty, a haven of rose gold mirrors and plush velvet seating. Hannah was standing at the sink, gripping the marble edge so hard her hands were trembling. She was staring at her own reflection, breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. "Having fun at the party, sis." Hannah whipped around a cornered animal. When she saw it was me, her posture immediately shifted. She pulled her shoulders back, lifting her chin, pasting on a haughty, superior sneer that looked absurd on her hollowed-out face. "Charlie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She dragged her eyes up and down my body, lingering on the slit of my dress. "I see the Powells haven't taught you the meaning of subtlety or modesty." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. The heavy silk rustled against my skin. "And I see the Montgomerys have taught you how to skip lunch. You look like a ghost, Hannah." Her eyes flashed, but she maintained the sneer. "I am disciplined, something you would know nothing about. Richard and Beatrice are preparing me for society. Real society. Not whatever mobster circles your new father runs in." I pushed off the doorframe and took a slow step toward her. The soft click of my heels on the tile seemed to make her flinch. Just a tiny, barely perceptible twitch in her left shoulder. "Is that what they're calling it?" I asked, my voice dropping lower, softer. I stepped closer, entering her personal space. The scent of rosewater was cloying, masking something sour underneath. "Discipline. Back off, Charlie," she snapped, but she took a step backward, her lower back hitting the edge of the sink. I reached out. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, her arms instinctively coming up to protect her face. I stopped. My hand hovered an inch from her cheek. The silence in the bathroom was deafening. The only sound was her ragged, terrified breathing. I stared at her cowering form. The vindication I thought I would feel was there, yes, thick and heavy, like syrup, but underneath it was a sickening, twisted sorrow. She was breaking, faster than I had, because she had thought she was walking into heaven, which made the descent into hell so much steeper. I lowered my hand. "I was just going to fix your hair," I said quietly, stepping back. Hannah opened her eyes. The humiliation of her own flinch burned bright red across her pale cheeks. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I don't need anything from you," she spat, her voice trembling. "I chose the better family. I won. I am the Montgomery heir. You're just a strayed dog the Powells picked up for charity. Don't you ever look at me with pity again." She pushed past me, her shoulder, intentionally knocking heavily into mine, and practically ran out the door. I turned and looked at myself in the mirror. My cheeks were flushed, my eyes dark and completely dry. "I don't pity you, Hannah," I whispered to the empty room, smoothing a wrinkle from the heavy silk of my dress. "I'm just waiting for you to shatter." Winter arrived with a brutal biting wind that stripped the trees bare and turned the city into a grid of gray concrete and dirty slush. By January, Anthony had pulled enough strings and written a large enough check to get me transferred into St. Jude's Preparatory Academy. It was the same school Hannah attended, the same school I had attended in my past life, walking the halls like a ghost, desperately trying to hide the bruises beneath my heavy wool blazer. Now, the scratchy plaid skirt and stiff cotton blouse felt different. They didn't feel like a disguise. They felt like armor, The St. Jude's cafeteria smelled of industrial bleach, baked ziti, and the pervasive sour scent of teenage anxiety. The hierarchy was rigid, carved into the cafeteria tables like ancient runes. The old money sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, basking in the weak winter sunlight. The new money, the scholarship kids, and the outcasts filled the shadowy middle ground. I sat in the middle, peeling the foil off a massive pastrami sandwich Maeve had packed for me. The sharp, vinegary smell of the mustard cut through the stale cafeteria air. Across the room, bathed in the pale light, sat Hannah. She was surrounded by girls with perfect blowouts and discreet trust funds, but she looked entirely alone. Her uniform hung off her frame. The plaid skirt, designed to be tailored and crisp, looked like a flag draped over a stick. I took a huge bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly, my eyes locked on her tray. While the other girls picked at salads or shared a plate of fries, Hannah had a single green apple and a bottle of sparkling water. She wasn't eating the apple. She was systematically cutting it into paper-thin, translucent slices with a plastic knife. Her movements were mechanical, obsessive. Slice, push to the side, slice, push to the side. Her knuckles were stark white, the skin pulled incredibly tight over the bone. Even from 20 feet away, I could see the faint, bluish tinge under her fingernails. Poor circulation. Her body was eating itself to stay warm. I swallowed the heavy, salty meat, feeling it hit the bottom of my stomach. It felt good. It felt solid. You wanted the discipline, I thought, washing the bite down with a gulp of iced tea. You wanted to be perfect. Suddenly, Hannah stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the linoleum, a harsh grating sound that made a few heads turn. She swayed, just a fraction of an inch, but I saw it. Her knees locked, her hand shooting out to grip the edge of the table. The girls around her kept talking, completely oblivious to the fact that the girl next to them was currently fighting gravity and losing. Hannah blinked rapidly, her face draining of what little color it had. She turned and began walking toward the double doors leading to the main hallway. Her gait was stiff, her shoulders hunched. I didn't think. I just moved. I abandoned my sandwich, sliding out of my seat and mirroring her path, keeping a healthy distance. The hallway outside the cafeteria was empty, the air noticeably colder. The only sound was the scuffing of our leather loafers on the polished tile. She made it to the bottom of the grand staircase before her legs finally gave out. There was no dramatic cry. It was just a silent, sudden collapse. Her knees buckled, and she pitched forward toward the hard edge of the bottom step. I closed the distance in 3 long strides. I caught her by the shoulders just before her face slammed into the marble. The physical impact of her body against mine made my breath catch. She weighed absolutely nothing. It was like catching a bundle of hollow reeds. Her bones jutted sharply against my palms through the thick wool of her blazer. She smelled faintly of old perfume and the sour metallic odor of ketosis. "Get off me," she hissed, immediately thrashing like a wild bird caught in a net. Her voice was weak, reedy. She shoved at my chest, but there was no force behind it. Her hands were freezing. I didn't let go. I hauled her upward, pinning her back against the cool plaster wall under the stairs out of sight of the cafeteria doors. "Stop moving, you idiot. You're going to crack your head open." I snapped my voice, low and harsh. She stopped struggling, her chest heaving as she sucked in shallow, panicked breaths. Her eyes were wide and dilated, struggling to focus on my face. A thin sheen of cold sweat coated her forehead. "I tripped," she lied, her voice trembling violently. She tried to pull her shoulders back to reconstruct the Montgomery posture, but her muscles were shaking too hard. "My shoe caught on the tile." "You passed out, Hannah." I kept my hands on her shoulders, feeling the tremors racking her fragile frame. "When was the last time you ate a full meal without Richard watching?" At the sound of his name, a visceral, full-body shudder ripped through her. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, terrified that he might somehow materialize from the shadows. "Don't say his name," she whispered, a sudden raw terror leaking into her tone. She looked back at me, her mask momentarily shattering, revealing the exhausted, terrified, 14-year-old girl underneath. "You don't understand Charlie. If I gain a single pound, he has a scale in the dining room. He weighs me before breakfast." My stomach turned over, a cold, sickening wave of nausea hitting me. I knew about the scale. In my past life, that scale had been the center of my universe. I knew the specific terrifying click it made when the dial settled. A normal sister would have hugged her. A normal sister would have dragged her to the nurse's office, called social services, blown the whistle. But I looked at her hollow cheeks and remembered the way she had smiled at my corpse. I let go of her shoulders and took a step back, wiping my palms on my skirt as if dusting off dirt. "Then you better not gain a pound," I said coldly. Hannah stared at me, the terror in her eyes slowly morphing back into familiar, brittle hatred. She pushed herself off the wall, using her hand to steady herself. "I'm fine," she spat, though her voice still wobbled. She smoothed her skirt with shaking hands. "I am a Montgomery. We don't break." "Right," I muttered, turning my back on her and walking back toward the noise of the cafeteria. "Try not to bleed on the marble, Hannah. Beatrice hates stains." The invitation was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering. The St. Jude's Winter Gala Planning Committee, hosted by Mrs. Beatrice Montgomery. Maeve had found it in my backpack and immediately assumed I wanted to go. She spent an hour excitedly pulling dresses from my closet, completely missing the way my hands were shaking, the way the blood had drained from my face. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to burn the invitation and lock myself in my bedroom. But hiding wouldn't change the past, and I needed to see the cage from the outside to fully believe I was free of it. Anthony drove me himself. He didn't take the Bentley. He took his heavy customized SUV. He sensed my tension. He didn't play his usual talk radio, and he didn't chew his nicotine gum. When we pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Montgomery estate, I stopped breathing. The tires crunched over the pristine white gravel. The house loomed at the end of the long driveway, a massive, imposing structure of dark stone in severe angles. It looked exactly the same. It smelled exactly the same, a mixture of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and cold money. "You don't have to do this, kid," Anthony said, shifting the car into park. He didn't look at me staring straight ahead at the grand oak double doors. "Say the word, and I'll throw this thing in reverse. We can go get ice cream, or I can buy you a jet ski. Whatever you want." I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. I looked at his massive hands, gripping the steering wheel. Safe hands. "I'm fine, Anthony. I'll text you when it's over." I stepped out into the freezing air. The wind whipped my hair across my face. I walked up the stone steps, my legs feeling heavy, like I was moving through water. Beatrice opened the door before I even rang the bell. She wore a high-collared cashmere sweater and dark slacks. Not a single hair was out of place. "Charlie," she said, her voice a perfectly modulated hum of polite indifference. How punctual. Do come in. Take off your shoes, please. The floors were just polished. I stepped into the foyer. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Lemon oil, old wood, and the faint, powdery scent of crushed irises. My vision blurred for a split second. Right there, just 5 feet to my left. That was where my head had hit the marble. I could almost see the dark spreading stain of my own blood. I squeezed my fists tight, letting my nails dig into my palms, until the sharp pain pulled me back to the present. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Montgomery. I said, my voice steady, though it took every ounce of my willpower. I followed her into the formal living room. 5 other girls from the committee were already there, perched awkwardly on antique velvet sofas, balancing fragile teacups on their knees. Hannah was sitting in a high-backed armchair by the unlit fireplace. She was wearing a thick, cable-knit turtleneck sweater. It was completely out of place. The house was suffocatingly warm, the central heating cranked up to combat the winter chill. The other girls were in thin blouses or short sleeves. Hannah was practically buried in wool. I took a seat on the sofa opposite her, declining the tea Beatrice offered with a polite shake of my head. The meeting was a blur of meaningless chatter about floral arrangements and catering budgets. I didn't participate. I just watched Hannah. She was completely rigid. Every time Beatrice moved, Hannah's eyes tracked her. When Beatrice spoke, Hannah nodded enthusiastically, her smile strained and manic. After an hour, Beatrice excused herself to take a phone call. The tension in the room instantly evaporated. The other girls slumped back into the velvet cushions, pulling out their phones. Hannah stood up, her movements stiff. I need to use the restroom, she muttered, to no one in particular, hurrying out of the room. I waited exactly 60 seconds before standing up and following her. I knew the layout of this house better than the back of my hand. I walked silently down the long carpeted hallway, bypassing the guest powder room. I knew where she would go. She would go to the small, tucked-away bathroom under the secondary stairs, the one with no windows, the one where you couldn't be heard if you cried. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open silently. Hannah was standing at the sink. She had pushed the sleeves of her thick sweater up to her elbows to wash her hands. My breath stopped in my throat. Wrapped around her left forearm, just below the elbow, was a massive, blooming bruise. It was fresh, a deep, angry purple, ringed with sickly yellow and black. It was the distinct shape of a large hand, the individual fingers perfectly outlined in bruised tissue, where someone had grabbed her and squeezed with bone-crushing force. I stared at it. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight of Richard's grip. I remembered the sound of his voice right by my ear. You will learn respect, Charlie. Hannah looked up and saw me in the mirror. She gasped a sharp, terrified sound and violently yanked her sleeves down, fumbling with the thick wool, her face flushing crimson. What are you doing here? She demanded, her voice cracking. Get out. I stepped fully into the bathroom, letting the door click shut behind me. The space was claustrophobic, smelling of sterile soap. Long sleeves in an 80-degree house. I said, keeping my voice flat, devoid of the pity I knew she would reject. I thought it was a bold fashion choice. Now it makes sense. You didn't see anything. Hannah snapped, backing away, until she hit the tiled wall. She hugged her arms to her chest, covering the hidden bruise. I tripped. I hit my arm on the banister. The banister has fingers now, I asked. She glared at me, her chest heaving. "Shut up. You don't know anything. Richard was he was teaching me a lesson about posture. I slouched at dinner. It was my fault. I provoked him." I closed my eyes for a second. "It was my fault. I provoked him." They were the exact words I had used to justify my own beatings to Mrs. Gable, terrified that if I told the truth, it would only get worse. "He's preparing me," Hannah insisted, her voice growing more frantic, desperate to convince herself as much as me. "He expects perfection because I'm his heir. It's tough love. You wouldn't understand living with those trashy people who let you do whatever you want. I'm being molded into something great." I opened my eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't being molded. She was being ground down into dust. The bright, ambitious, vicious 14-year-old who had stolen my adoption was gone. In her place was a terrified, starving animal desperately trying to love the hand that beat her. "He's going to kill you, Hannah," I said. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and absolute. Hannah flinched as if I had struck her. "You're just jealous," she whispered, a tear finally breaking free and spilling over her hollow cheek. "You're jealous that they chose me." I reached out and placed my hand on the doorknob. I felt no triumph, just a cold, heavy exhaustion. "I'm not jealous," I said, softly, opening the door. "I'm just waiting for the funeral." March brought a suffocating, damp thaw to the city, and with it, the St. Jude's Spring Conservatory. The auditorium smelled of ancient floor wax rosin and the nervous, sour sweat of 100 overachieving teenagers. I sat between Anthony and Maeve in the third row. Anthony was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, the velvet upholstery too narrow for his broad shoulders, smelling faintly of the garlic knots he had eaten in the SUV. Maeve was thumbing through the glossy program, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together. I stared straight ahead at the massive, polished Steinway grand piano resting center stage under the harsh, blinding glare of the spotlights. Hannah was the closing act. It was a position of profound honor, bought and paid for by Richard Montgomery's generous endowment to the music department. She was scheduled to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece that demanded massive, power-heavy hands and relentless stamina, everything she no longer had. When her name was finally called, the polite smattering of applause sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Hannah walked out from the heavy maroon curtains. She wore a floor-length dress of stark, unyielding black velvet. It swallowed her. She moved with the slow, terrifying carefulness of a porcelain doll balanced on a tightrope. Her skin under the stage lights wasn't just pale. It was entirely bloodless, a sickly, translucent gray. She bowed, a shallow, rigid dip of her shoulders. Then she sat at the bench. From the third row, I could see the fine tremor in her hands as she hovered them over the keys. I could hear the shallow, rapid hitch of her breathing. She struck the first 3 chords. Loud, heavy, imposing. For a minute, she held the illusion. Her fingers moved with frantic, desperate muscle memory. But the piece is a marathon, and Hannah was running on empty fumes in sheer terror. By the second page, the tempo began to drag. Her wrists, thin as dry twigs, lacked the weight to depress the keys fully. The lower bass notes started to sound muddy, half-struck. Then came the intricate rapid-fire middle section. Her right hand cramped. I saw it happen. Her ring and pinky fingers curled inward, spasming violently. She missed a sharp, Then, a natural. The discordant, jarring notes echoed through the silent, cavernous auditorium. It sounded like glass breaking. Hannah froze. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling so violently they were a blur. The silence that followed was absolute, thick, suffocating, and terrifying. In the front row, directly in Hannah's line of sight, sat Richard Montgomery. He didn't gasp. He didn't frown. He simply uncrossed his legs, the faint squeak of his leather shoe cutting through the dead air. He stared at her, his face a mask of cold, terrifying blankness. Hannah let out a sound. It wasn't a sob. It was a high, thin wheeze, like a dying bird. She pushed the heavy wooden bench back so hard it screeched against the stage floor, turned, and sprinted blindly into the wings. The audience erupted into uncomfortable hushed murmurs. Anthony let out a low whistle. "Rough break for the kid," he muttered. "I'm going to the bathroom," I said, my voice completely devoid of inflection. I didn't wait for a response. I slid past Maeve, my pulse drumming a heavy, dark rhythm in my throat. I didn't go to the public restrooms. I pushed through the heavy fire doors, leading to the backstage corridors. The air back here was cold and smelled of ozone and hot dust from the lighting rigs. I heard the sound before I saw them. A sharp, hollow crack. I stopped dead at the edge of the prop room. The door was cracked open. Through the narrow slit, I saw Hannah on her knees, on the dirty concrete floor, the black velvet pooling around her like an oil spill. She had her arms wrapped protectively around her head. Richard stood over her. His back was to me, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He was casually adjusting the cuff of his pristine white shirt. "Get up," he said. His voice was a soft, deadly hum. Hannah let out a muffled, ragged whimper. I'm sorry. My hand cramped. I couldn't. I said, "Get up." She scrambled to her feet, swaying violently, her cheek blazing with a raw red handprint that contrasted violently with her gray skin. "You embarrassed me." Richard stated his tone, conversational, as if commenting on the weather. "You sat on that stage, carrying my name, and you quit. You showed them weakness. What are you, Hannah?" "I'm a Montgomery." She choked out tears, finally spilling, ruining her heavy mascara. "No." Richard took a half step forward. Hannah flinched backward, her spine hitting a stack of wooden crates. "You are an investment that is rapidly losing its value. If you cannot perform, you are useless to me. Do you understand what happens to useless things in my house?" A cold phantom pain shot through my own ribs. I knew exactly what happened. The basement room, the lock turning from the outside, the silence that lasted for days. Hannah nodded frantically, her teeth chattering. "I understand. I'll practice more. I won't eat until I get it perfect. Please." Richard stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he reached out and gently, affectionately, tucked a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut, leaning into the touch, even as her whole body shook with terror. "Go to the car," he whispered. She didn't hesitate. She bolted past him, practically tearing the side exit door off its hinges to escape into the cold night air. Richard stood alone in the dim room for a second. Then he turned slowly, his dark eyes locking exactly onto the crack in the door, onto me. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, stepping fully into the light. I didn't break eye contact. I let my face go completely dead, bearing the rising panic deep in my chest. "She lacks stamina, Mr. Montgomery. I said, my voice a flat, razor-thin wire. You're starving the muscle away. You can't expect a hollowed-out bird to pull a plow. Richard tilted his head. A slow, deeply unpleasant smile spread across his face. Charlie, it's been a while. You're looking robust. I eat, I replied coldly. He took a step toward me. The smell of his expensive cologne sandalwood and sharp citrus hit my nose instantly, triggering a wave of nausea. But I dug the heels of my boots into the concrete. I didn't step back. She chose the discipline, Richard said softly, stopping 3 feet away. She begged for it. You, on the other hand, you were always so defiant, so full of fire. It's a shame. You would have been magnificent once broken. I looked at the red handprint, still fading in the air between us. I looked at the man who had crushed my windpipe in another life to secure a trust fund. A dark, terrifying thrill suddenly sparked in my chest. He thought he was the only predator in the room. You made a bad investment, Richard, I said, using his first name, dropping all pretense of respect. She's going to crack before she turns 18. And when she does, the mess is going to get on your shoes. His smile vanished. The amusement was replaced by a cold, reptilian calculation. Mind your own business, little girl. Anthony Powell's money can't protect you from everything. It doesn't have to, I said, turning my back on him. The ultimate insult. I walked away, my boots echoing off the concrete. I can protect myself. The realization hit me 3 days later, standing in the middle of a muddy construction site in the pouring rain. Anthony had insisted on taking me to see the new Powell commercial development, a massive, multi-million-dollar, high-rise project on the waterfront. We were standing under a flimsy plastic awning, the sharp smell of wet concrete and diesel exhaust filling the damp air. Anthony was pointing at a set of blueprints spread across the hood of his truck, chewing his gum furiously. See this parcel here? He tapped a thick, calloused finger on a section shaded in red. Montgomery's holding company owns it. It's a tiny strip, totally useless on its own. But it blocks our main access road. He refuses to sell. He's trying to bleed me on the logistics force a partnership. I stared at the red square. The rain drummed a chaotic rhythm against the plastic tarp above us. Why would he want a partnership? I asked, wiping a drop of cold water from my cheek. He hates new money. He looks at you like you're a disease. Anthony let out a harsh bark of laughter. Pride doesn't pay the mortgage, Charlie. Montgomery's old money is old, stagnant. He's cash poor. His philanthropic foundation is bleeding capital, and his last 3 investments tanked. He needs a high-yield liquid asset. He needs a piece of this building to keep the bank off his back. I froze. The noise of the construction site seemed to fade into a dull hum. He's cash poor. In my past life, Richard hadn't been desperate yet. Or maybe he had been. And that was why he murdered me at 19, to trigger the massive life insurance policy he had quietly taken out in my name. Hannah wasn't just a trophy to him. She was an asset. And right now, she was the only leverage he had left to maintain the illusion of his untouchable wealth. Sigh, what happens? I started my voice, sounding distant to my own ears. If it gets out that the great Richard Montgomery is physically abusing his adopted daughter, what happens to a philanthropic foundation built on family values? When the police get called to the estate, Anthony stopped chewing his gum. He looked at me, his bushy eyebrows pulling together in a heavy scowl. The genial, loud father figure vanished, replaced by the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from dirt. If that happened, Anthony said slowly, his eyes locked on mine. The board would oust him in 24 hours. His creditors would call in his debts. He'd lose the house, the holding company, the land, everything. He paused, his gaze narrowing. "Why are you asking me this, Charlie?" I looked down at the mud, caking my expensive leather boots. I felt the ghost of a fractured skull. I felt the memory of Hannah's breathless, victorious laughter as I bled out on the marble. I didn't want to save her. I had tried to warn her. I had given her a chance to walk away to tell the truth. She had chosen the crown, even as the metal cut into her skin. She had looked at my bruised face in the past life and thought I was weak, but I could use her. Just curious, I lied smoothly, looking back up at Anthony with a perfectly bland expression. "If he offers the land, take it. But don't sign a partnership. Give it 3 months. He won't have the leverage anymore." Anthony stared at me for a long time. The wind howled, rattling the plastic tarp. He didn't ask questions. He just slowly nodded. 3 months. Okay, kid. 3 months. That night, I sat in the dark of my sprawling, quiet bedroom. The only light came from the glow of my laptop screen. I had created a dummy email account, routed through 3 different VPNs. I attached the photograph I had taken weeks ago at the St. Jude's Gala, the high-resolution image of Hannah and Richard. But I didn't send the original. I sent the digitally enhanced version, the one where I had adjusted the contrast and shadow, just enough to make the faint, yellowing bruise on Hannah's wrist bone visible beneath the sheer fabric of her sleeve. I attached a second file, a recording I had discreetly taken on my phone backstage at the conservatory. The audio was grainy, but Richard's voice was unmistakable. "If you cannot perform, you are useless to me. Do you understand what happens to useless things in my house?" I hovered my cursor over the to field. I typed in the email addresses of the 3 most prominent investigative journalists in the city, the head of the Child Welfare Division, and the entire board of directors of the Montgomery Philanthropic Foundation. My finger rested on the trackpad. If I sent this, Hannah's life would detonate. The fallout would be catastrophic. The scandal would rip away the only thing she cared about: the Montgomery name, the prestige, the illusion of perfection. She would be dragged through the courts, exposed, pitied. She would lose the crown, but Richard would be destroyed. I closed my eyes. I inhaled the scent of my own room. Clean linen, expensive lavender, safety. "Take them, sister," I thought, echoing my own words from the adoption agency. "I'll enjoy the show." I pressed click. The screen flashed, confirming the message was sent. There was no going back. The blood was in the water, and the sharks were already circling. I closed the laptop, plunging the room into total darkness. I lay back on my soft, massive bed, listening to the rain beat against the glass. And for the first time since I woke up in this second life, I slept without dreaming. The explosion didn't happen overnight. It took exactly 48 hours for the detonator to burn down to the powder. It was a Tuesday morning. The Powell kitchen smelled heavily of sizzling bacon, fresh espresso, and the sharp tang of grapefruit. I was sitting at the marble island, tracing the rim of a ceramic mug, watching the rain streak the floor-to-ceiling windows. Anthony walked in his heavy boots, thudding against the floorboards. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was loose. He dropped a thick stack of morning papers onto the counter with a heavy, definitive thud. He didn't say a word. He just tapped his thick, calloused index finger on the front page of the Chronicle. The headline took up half the page: printed in bold, unforgiving black ink. Montgomery Philanthropy. A facade. Allegations of abuse and financial ruin shatter high society. Below, it was the photo. My photo. The zoomed-in, contrast-adjusted shot of Hannah's bruised wrist, placed side by side with a glamorous, smiling portrait of Richard Montgomery. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. I reached out and touched the cheap newsprint. The ink smeared slightly against my fingertip, leaving a dark, ashy stain. Channel 4. Anthony grunted, pouring himself a mug of black coffee. Turn it on. I grabbed the remote and flicked the wall-mounted television to the local news. The screen flickered, showing live, shaky helicopter footage of the Montgomery estate. The pristine white gravel driveway was choked with police cruisers, unmarked black sedans, and a sea of news vans. Flashing red and blue lights painted the imposing dark stone of the mansion in chaotic, violent strokes. They raided the foundation's corporate offices at dawn. Anthony said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. His eyes never left my face. The board suspended Richard at midnight. The bank froze all assets pending an investigation into embezzled charity funds to cover his personal debts. And Child Protective Services executed an emergency removal order at 6 a.m. I watched the screen. A pair of officers were marching Richard Montgomery down the front steps of his own home. He was in handcuffs. He wasn't wearing a tie, and his pristine white shirt was rumpled. He looked smaller. The terrifying, omnipotent monster of my past life was just a balding, cash-poor man blinking furiously into the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras. Then the camera panned to the side entrance. 2 social workers were leading Hannah out of the house. A heavy wool blanket was draped over her shoulders, but it couldn't hide how fiercely she was fighting them. She was thrashing her thin arms, flailing wildly. She wasn't running away from the house. She was trying to run back inside. I cranked the volume up. The audio feed from the ground reporter picked up the faint, reedy sound of her screaming. "No, leave me alone. I'm a Montgomery. You can't do this to us. Let go of me." She was clawing at the social worker's arms, desperate to stay in her cage. She didn't look relieved. She looked like a junkie being dragged away from a fix. I hit the mute button. The sudden silence in the kitchen was ringing. Anthony leaned against the counter, crossing his massive arms. He smelled of spearmint gum and something sharp like static electricity. "The audio file you sent," Anthony said quietly. "Not a question, a statement of fact. The one where he threatens her. The forensic analysts confirmed it's his voice. That's what triggered the emergency removal." I kept my eyes glued to the muted television. "I don't know what you're talking about." Anthony let out a low, rumbling chuckle. It wasn't entirely humorous. There was a deep, unsettling respect in it. "Sure you don't, kid. But just so we're clear, his lawyer called me an hour ago, offered me the waterfront parcel for 20 cents on the dollar if I could advance him the cash for bail." I finally looked away from the screen meeting Anthony's hard, craggy gaze. "Did you take it?" "I told him to go to hell," Anthony said flatly. "I don't do business with dead men. By Friday, the bank will seize the land anyway. I'll buy it at auction for pennies." He reached across the island and placed his heavy, warm hand over my cold, ink-stained fingers. "You have a brutal bite, Charlie," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I don't know what happened between you and that family. I don't know why you did it. But you protected this house. You protected our business. You're a Powell." I looked down at his hand, covering mine. The phantom ache in my skull, the ghost of the marble floor, suddenly went quiet. It didn't vanish entirely, but the screaming stopped. I had pulled the pin. The explosion had leveled the Montgomery Empire, turning their legacy into ash and cheap tabloid gossip. But as I looked back at the television, watching my sister being shoved into the back of an unmarked state vehicle, her face twisted in a mask of absolute shattered despair, I felt no victory, just a cold, hollow exhaustion settling deep into the marrow of my bones. The juvenile psychiatric wing of St. Agnes Hospital smelled of boiled carrots, heavy industrial floor wax, and defeated air. It had been 3 weeks since the raid. 3 weeks of front-page scandals. Beatrice Montgomery had filed for divorce and fled to a clinic in Switzerland, abandoning Richard entirely. Richard was currently sitting in a county jail cell, denied bail as federal investigators dug through 10 years of fraudulent tax returns and missing charity funds. And Hannah was here, placed on an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold that had quickly turned into an indefinite stay. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the visitor's room, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The room was aggressively bright, lit by humming fluorescent tubes that gave everything a sickly, greenish cast. The heavy metal door clicked open. A tired-looking orderly escorted Hannah into the room and stepped back out, leaving the door cracked. I looked up. If she had looked like a ghost at the school conservatory, she looked like a corpse now. She was wearing shapeless, faded blue cotton scrubs. Without her expensive makeup, the dark bruised bags under her eyes looked permanent. Her blonde hair was dull and matted, tied back with a cheap elastic band. But her eyes were still burning. She stopped 3 feet away from me. She didn't sit in the empty plastic chair across the table. She just stood there, radiating a raw, toxic hatred that practically made the air vibrate. They said I had a visitor. Hannah rasped her voice, completely stripped of its practiced high society polish. I thought it was Richard's lawyer. I should have known it was the rat. I didn't flinch. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands in my lap. He doesn't have a lawyer anymore, Hannah. His accounts are frozen. The public defender isn't coming to visit you. Her jaw clenched, the muscles ticking violently. You did this. The email. The audio. It was you. Yes, I said. No hesitation. No denial. Just a flat, heavy truth dropped between us. Hannah lunged forward, slamming her hands flat onto the cheap laminate table. The plastic cracked under the force. Why? She screamed, spittle flying from her cracked lips. I had it all. I was a Montgomery. I was going to inherit everything. I was going to be somebody. You were going to be dead. I said, my voice eerily calm against her hysteria. He was starving you. He was beating you. He was using you as a prop to distract his creditors. You were an asset, Hannah. And when you stopped performing, he would have discarded you, like he discarded me. I thought the memory of my own blood, tasting like copper, in my mouth. You're lying, she shrieked, clutching her own arms, burying her nails into the faded blue cotton. He loved me. He was just strict. He was preparing me for greatness. You ruined it because you were jealous. You couldn't handle that. They picked me over you. I looked at her. I really, truly looked at the pathetic broken girl standing in front of me. She wasn't mourning a father. She was mourning the crown. She didn't care about the bruises, the hunger, the terror, so long as it came with the marble floors and the embossed invitations. In her twisted, desperate mind, the abuse was a toll she was willing to pay for the prestige. and she hated me for taking away her ability to pay it. The last lingering shred of guilt I had been carrying, the tiny, pathetic part of me that thought I owed her something because we shared blood, withered, and died right there on the sterile linoleum floor. I stood up slowly, the plastic chair scraping loudly behind me. "I gave you the Powells," I said softly, the absolute finality in my voice, making her stop screaming. "In that office 10 years ago, I took the Quiet family, because you asked me to. I took the Montgomerys." Hannah blinked her brow, furrowing in confusion at the sudden shift in my tone. She didn't know about the past life. She didn't know the depth of what I had suffered for her. "I tried to give you the safe home." I continued stepping around the table toward the door. "And you paid me back by stealing the cage. You fought for the cage, Hannah. You bled for it. You wanted the Montgomery name so badly. You let it break your bones." I paused at the heavy metal door, gripping the cold steel handle. I didn't look back at her. I couldn't bear to look at the hollowed-out shell of my sister anymore. "Well, you have it now," I said, my voice entirely empty. "You're Hannah Montgomery, and the name is worth absolutely nothing." I pushed the door open and walked out into the hallway. Behind me, Hannah let out a sound. It wasn't a scream of anger. It was a long, ragged, animalistic wail of absolute despair. The sound of a girl realizing she was entirely alone in the dark. I didn't stop. I walked down the long, brightly lit corridor, my boots clicking firmly against the floor. I walked past the orderly, past the security desk, and out the heavy glass double doors into the bright, biting afternoon air. Anthony was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against the hood of his massive SUV, chewing a fresh piece of gum. When he saw me, he pushed off the truck and opened the passenger door. "Everything good, kid?" he asked, his rough voice carrying easily over the wind. I inhaled deeply. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, damp concrete, and coming rain. It smelled real. "Yeah, Anthony," I said, climbing into the warm, leather interior of the Powell truck. The ghost of the marble floor was finally gone. "Everything is perfect. Let's go home." If you found yourself holding your breath during Charlie's twisted reunion with her sister, you aren't alone. The psychological warfare has only just begun. What happens when the Montgomerys' dark secrets threaten to spill into the Powells' chaotic empire? Will Charlie step in to save the sister who betrayed her? Or will she watch the gilded cage finally snap shut? Drop a comment below with what you think Charlie should do. Don't forget to smash that like button. Share this with your fellow drama lovers and subscribe